Hey guys, it's Mike here, and I just finished watching The Falcon and the Winter Soldier Season 1, the newest MCU show on Disney+. Now, going into the series, I wasn't really excited or hyped for it. Much like the rest of the MCU after Endgame, it looked pretty generic and underwhelming, with nothing really in it that hooked me or made me that interested, aside from the continuation of the story at the end of Endgame, in which Falcon was given the shield, and would be teaming up with the Winter Soldier. Now, I was a big fan of the Captain America trilogy, which is probably the best trilogy, at least as standalone movies, in the entire MCU. Beginning with Joe Johnston's Captain America the First Avenger, which is really good, followed by Captain America the Winter Soldier, which for me is probably the best MCU movie so far. And then Captain America Civil War, which was basically its own Avengers movie, pitting the heroes against one another, which also ended up being pretty great, although I didn't think it was quite as good as the Winter Soldier. And with the end of Endgame basically setting up this series with the Falcon getting Captain America's shield, I should have been excited going into this, but I really wasn't. And my expectations were pretty low. And upon finishing the show, I'd have to say that the series pretty much lived up to those expectations. Because for me, Falcon and the Winter Soldier is pretty underwhelming and mediocre as an MCU show. Not living up to the heights of the Captain America series of movies, or really being as good as this show should have been and how they hyped up these MCU shows to be. Which I guess is a recurring theme so far, considering how WandaVision turned out. But with that being said, let's get into this review now. So the plot of Falcon and the Winter Soldier follows the Falcon, who despite just being handed the shield by Captain America, decide, you know what, I don't think I should be Captain America, and just immediately gives it up, which basically undoes that big moment at the end of Endgame in an instant, which for me definitely wasn't a good start to this show. And guess what? Immediately after this, the United States government is like, nah, we'll just take that shield and give it to somebody else, John Walker, the new Captain America, a two-time Medal of Honor winning soldier who didn't even have any superpowers at the time, and could basically be the United States government's version of Captain America, complete with his own sidekick, Battlestar, who would go around fighting crime in the name of America. Naturally, Bucky, the Winter Soldier, had a big problem with this, considering the fact that his best friend of over 100 years gave Sam the shield, which immediately he threw away, causing tension between the two in this show. Meanwhile, during all of this, Bucky is going to therapy and trying to make amends with the people that he hurt along the way as the Winter Soldier, including one man whose son he killed, but he can't find the strength to actually tell him. But all of this is interrupted when the Flag Smashers, a bunch of one-world government terrorists, show up and start destroying things and doing everything in the name of bringing things back to the way they were during the blip, the basically apocalyptic event in which half the life in the universe disappeared and the governments of the world had to drastically change things up, and basically unite a lot of the people under one banner. Something that we never actually saw on screen, but we just gotta have to take the series' word for it. So the Falcon and the Winter Soldier have to team up in order to try and put a stop to the Flag Smashers, and try and reclaim the name of Captain America from John Walker, who at the same time is also trying to take down the Flag Smashers and claim all the glory for himself. But can they do it, and will it be anything other than boring? Well, I guess we'll find out. So let me get into the things I liked first about this story. First off being the action, because of course this is an MCU series and it features Falcon the Winter Soldier, so you know you're gonna get a lot of action. And honestly, overall, I'd probably say the action is the best part of the series, with the first episode beginning with a really good action sequence that shows the Falcon flying around through mountains and escaping missiles and taking down helicopters, which is definitely his coolest action sequence so far and probably one of the best of the MCU. And generally throughout the show, the action is handled really well. You can tell that they really went out of their way to try and make the action here seem just as good as it would be in the movies. So generally when you get an action sequence, it really picks up the episode for you, and turns up the intensity, especially with the music in the background, which I generally thought was also really good in this series, helping to establish the tone and give emotional impact to a lot of the scenes that required it. Another thing that was great was the performances in the show, particularly from Sebastian Stan, who probably gives his best performance I've seen from him yet as the Winter Soldier. You could tell that this guy has a lot of remorse inside of him for all the things that he did over the years, which unfortunately, even though he was mind controlled, he can still remember. The scene of him in Wakanda getting rid of his programming, and the interactions with the old man whose son he killed are all really great, and show just how talented of an actor he is. If it wasn't for the way that Disney treated Luke Skywalker, I would heavily consider having him be recast in the role. Although considering how Star Wars turned out, it might be a better idea for him to avoid that altogether. Anthony Mackie also does a pretty good job in the role of the Falcon, giving a strong performance in a number of different scenes throughout the series that goes to show you just why Steve Rogers picked him for the role of the next Captain America. And really, the overall chemistry between the two titular characters, the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, is really great overall, bringing a lot of those buddy cop vibes to the story, and making you understand where both of them are coming from and seeing them together as a team. The same could be said for Baron Zemo, who also returns in this series, and pretty much everything that he does throughout is great. His interactions with the characters, how he manipulates people, and really brings that villainous perspective. And a lot of this comes down to the great performance of Daniel Bruhl, who's been doing a great job with this character ever since Captain America Civil War. Although unfortunately, despite it heavily factoring into the promotional material such as the trailers, he literally only wears his Baron Zemo mask for one scene, which was probably just to put it in the trailer to appeal to people. So that basically felt like straight up clickbait on the part of Marvel. And really, all the character building stuff with these characters was well done, bringing them through their own specific arcs for the course of the story and giving them a number of different character building moments that I thought worked pretty well. Although unfortunately, I think that Zemo would have been better served as being the main villain of this story overall, which unfortunately he wasn't. And I would definitely have to say that that might have been the biggest con of the series so far, that the actual villains of the story are pretty weak, particularly the Flag Smashers, led by Carly Morgenthau, who played Enfys Nest from Solo: A Star Wars Story, who honestly is a pretty terrible main villain, being this totally unintimidating and small child-looking character, who's significantly smaller than all of the heroes, and yet we're supposed to believe that just because she took the Super Soldier Serum, that she's a big threat to people like the Falcon and the Winter Soldier especially, or even John Walker later in the show. And the series really goes out of its way to try and make us sympathize with her and the Flag Smashers in general, but it simply doesn't work because she's such an unlikable leader and character, who blows people up and does terrible things left and right while trying to justify everything that she does, and pushing her pretty clear political message, which sometimes it makes you wonder if the series itself is kind of on board with. And even then, their actual goal is pretty muddled, since they don't really elaborate on what exactly would happen after they actually get everything over with. Again, probably because they never actually showed most of what happened during the blip, which isn't really as much of an issue with this show so much as I guess Endgame, or really how Marvel handled the fallout from Avengers Infinity War. I also didn't really care for the entire false Captain America storyline. Now, I thought that Wyatt Russell, the person who plays John Walker, did a really good job, giving a strong performance throughout. However, I still didn't really care for this overall storyline at all. In many ways, it felt like the MCU's answer to The Boys' Homelander, just not being anywhere near as interesting or really as vicious as that character was. Really, one of the biggest and most damning issues for this series for me is the fact that Sam should have just had the shield and been Captain America from the start, rather than giving it up immediately and building the entire arc of the show around him getting it back and taking over that mantle, which he already had to begin with. It should have focused instead on him being Captain America from the start, facing adversity, and figuring out truly what it meant to be Cap, and just how his path differed from Steve's. We didn't need an entire season filled with convoluted storytelling and another person donning the identity before that happened. It just should have been the case after Avengers Endgame. And talking about convoluted storytelling, there's a lot of plot holes and things that really just don't make sense throughout the story. Be it the way that characters act, some of their motivations, one major character just kind of being evil for no good reason, and doing a lot of bad things despite the fact that we didn't even see them actually develop into this character and it pretty much all happened off screen. And a lot of things that when you really stop and think about them for more than 2 seconds, or more than the show hopes you will, they really fall apart, which is really a shame because the writing of the show never quite lives up to the action or the performances of many of the actors in it. And unfortunately, another problem which I've seen a lot of people talking about recently is the fact that the entire woke movement crept into this show too. Whether it be ham-fisted dialogue or blatant in-your-face scenes like Sam and Bucky being accosted by the police, or this one-world government group led by a female character who wants to push this agenda that the show really tries to make us relate to and keep saying, oh, you shouldn't label them as terrorists, despite the fact that they're killing people left and right, and doing horrible things and not caring about the consequences, and the fact that the series constantly feels the need to bring up Sam's ethnicity and try and make it such a big deal when it shouldn't be. And the best way to approach this is not to make it an issue at all, and just to have Sam be a well-written character who embodies the role of Captain America. There's always going to be stupid and racist people out there, but you don't need to constantly stop the show in its tracks to make statements about it. Or how somehow handing someone like Sam the shield is some big controversial thing, when the only thing I've ever heard any MCU fan complaining about is the fact that they thought that Bucky should have been given the shield just because of his relationship with Captain America and his story arc. It had nothing to do with what Sam looked like, but because of the fact that Disney and a lot of these other companies try to virtue signal and shove as much of these politics into their properties as possible, we naturally had to deal with it here too. And it's something that's become more and more in your face ever since Captain Marvel came out. Now that isn't to say that Captain America shouldn't involve any politics at all. Obviously it should. And when you look at a movie like The Winter Soldier, that movie handled it so much better than this show and pretty much everything since Captain America has. There's a good way of inserting politics into your story that actually works within what you're trying to tell. And then there's stuff like this show where it feels like they're basically preaching to the audience, and basically calling a lot of them bad and telling them what they should think. And honestly, at this point, I'm just tired of it. Whether it be in the MCU or all these other blockbuster franchises. And really, when it's coming from these giant corporations who don't actually care about their customers aside from how much they could exploit them into paying for their products, and who in the past haven't exactly had a clean record when it comes to some of the stuff they're preaching, it ends up feeling totally disingenuous and seems more like virtue signaling so they can try and get brownie points in Hollywood rather than actually telling a compelling narrative, which oftentimes seems to fall to the wayside, as they're more concerned about getting their message out than actually telling a good story along the way. And then they wonder why so many of these projects end up doing terribly. And after all that, the ending here was pretty weak as well, with a number of the characters basically just putting aside their differences and teaming up, and John Walker in particular having a really fast face turn that felt like something straight out of Batman v Superman, where 1 second characters are trying to murder each other and the next, hey, let's be friends. And naturally, the character Carly doesn't really get the just desserts that she deserves. Instead, her story is wrapped up in a pretty anticlimactic way, involving a character who just had a big twist reveal that was pretty obvious from the beginning, and doesn't really even lead to anything exciting. Pretty much none of the setups here, even the post-credit sequence, are exciting. And much like in WandaVision, nothing here has me hyped to see a future movie or TV show. By the end of it, it was just kind of over. And honestly, I didn't really care. So overall, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier is an underwhelming MCU show. It has some good action sequences, some strong character moments, and great performances from people like Sebastian Stan. But the plot itself is weak, the main villains suck, and the show feels the need to lecture people and constantly interject more woke politics into episodes, which is becoming a theme of the MCU ever since Captain Marvel. It set up nothing interesting for the future, and gave Falcon a character arc he didn't even need, in order to take on the mantle that they already gave him at the end of Endgame. They really hyped up these MCU shows on Disney Plus like they were gonna be these great shows on the same level as some of the best movies. But so far, they haven't even been half as good as the best Netflix shows. Daredevil, for instance, puts both WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier combined to shame. And while I will no doubt rewatch Daredevil, which I've already done in the past, I have no real desire to ever watch these Disney Plus shows again. And I think that's pretty damning of this Disney Plus MCU experiment so far. Well, hopefully Loki will be good, because if not, that's Marvel's third strike. And despite being a hardcore Marvel fan who's seen every movie and show since I was a kid, if they don't turn things around, I might just say goodbye to the MCU. Make sure to subscribe and enable all notifications so you can stay up to date with all of my videos. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.